Welcome back to the pre-recorded version of today's lecture. Today we're going to begin our unit on slavery by beginning to imagine or visualize the burden of history that slavery has upon us as human beings. And we're going to be doing that through relatively simple audiovisual exercise using this rope which we stretched out behind me. But before I do that, I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce to you my two faithful helpers who will be working with me to film these lectures and edit them and get them ready for you through the course of this quarter so that we can do what we need to get done. If I could bring the first one out here. This is Arda.
Hello.
Introduce yourself, Arda.
I'm Arda, I'm 13, and I go to Emerson Junior High. The courses that I'm studying this quarter are PE, drama, and French, too.
All right, thank you, Arda. Arda's going to stay up here. You're going to help me. Cameraman, get up here. Who's this?
Hello, I'm Alam Watanpa. I go to Da Vinci.
How old are you?
I'm 13.
You're twins. Okay. Yes, continue.
Okay.
Continue.
My course is PE, math, and AP engineering.
All right, ag engineering, right?
Yeah.
Agriculture engineering.
Yeah.
Rom's learning how to be a farmer.
AP.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to think about slavery and its history as part of what it meant to be human for much of human existence. And we've laid out about 120 feet of rope back here to represent about 12,000 years of history, where every 10 feet or so represents about 1,000 years. So Arda is going to be slowly bringing in this line to help us understand when slavery began and how slavery began to end. So Arda, you're going to have to bring in a lot of rope before we have the first historical record of enslavement. So why don't you bring in the rope about 8 times. 8 times. So Arda's going to be bringing in the rope as I talk. Go ahead, Arda. Grab the rope. Start bringing it in about 8 times and just pile it up here right behind me. All right. So we know that antique people, that ancient peoples who lived before recorded history, I'm sure they had history, they didn't record it in any way that we now have access to, but they were Neolithic hunter-gatherers living in small communities without a great deal of social stratification. That slavery was very rare. It wasn't something that was broadly practiced, and certainly wasn't something that was of a concern for a government or a state. So how much progress have you made, Arda? You've gotten in about 8,000? So we're talking about 4,000 years ago. About 4,000 years is when, oh, you want me to scoot over? Okay. About 4,000 years ago is when we begin to have the first recorded incidents of slavery being practiced, but also being part of a legal code. And we know a great deal about that because of the preservation of what's called the Code of Hammurabi, from about 2000 before the Common Era, so a little bit over 4,000 years ago. And the Code of Hammurabi was a code of law that was developed for the Mesopotamian Valley civilizations, the Babylonians and so on, and this is in contemporary Iraq. And much of the law code has to do with understanding not that slavery is wrong, but how to practice slavery and how to compensate people for the loss of slaves. In other words, slaves were what? Slaves were seen as property, and the role of the state was to protect the property of property owners. So, for example, Law 15 of Hammurabi's code tells us, quote, if anyone take a male or female slave of the court, or a male or female slave of a freedman outside the city gates, he shall be put to death. In other words, stealing a slave was sort of like rustling cattle in the Old West, and I don't say that facetiously. The enslaved human was viewed as a kind of stock, a kind of property of extreme value, that the theft of which would lead to so much disruption that the penalty of death was what would be exacted for someone who might steal a slave. We know that Athens, ancient Athens, which is often looked to as the ideal democracy, had the largest slave population in the free world, where about 1/3 of the population was enslaved. Another third of the population was female and had very little rights or say in society, meaning that it was a 2/3 unfree society and a 1/3 free society. It maybe had 80,000 slaves in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. Roman civilization had perhaps 15 to 20% of the population was enslaved. So why don't we bring, we're up to the 5th century BC, we went from 8,000, so another 1,000 brings us up to 1,000 BC, and why don't you bring another up, and that brings us up to almost to the year 0 of the Common Era. Slavery, of course, persists into the last 2,000 years, not only in ancient Roman society, but also in the societies of the Mediterranean, of South Asia, East Asia, and North and South America. Slavery was part of virtually every developed agricultural society on the planet. Istanbul, in the 1500s, bring this in another full 1.5. About 1500, okay? Bring it in a couple more. You're not bringing it in enough. Bring it in much longer. Big, giant poles, Arda. Bring it in. Oh, sorry, camera. Bring it in some more. More. Now, we're now approximating about 1,500 years ago. About 500 years ago. In Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, about in the year 1500, 20% of the population was slaves. Right? And these were often European Christians or Jews. But in the year 1500, slavery began to change. And in many ways, this is when our contemporary understanding of slavery began. 1500 coincides with 1492, the European discovery, conquest, occupation, and genocide in the New World. From the period 1500, which is about where Arda is now, come forward another big giant, come on, one more, big giant one. From about 1500 to about 1800, 12 to 20 million Africans were enslaved, brought across the Atlantic Ocean in what is called the Middle Passage. Now, I want Arda to drop the rope on the ground over there, and I want you to hold up the rope that's left. And go, and I'll hold this, go back from me. Now, hold this. This length of rope represents approximately the last 200 years of human history. And can Aram pan down to the pile of rope that's here in front of us? So there's this giant pile of rope that's here in front of us now. This is how long we've had the burden of slavery upon us as a human species. It's long. It's a long time. And only in the last, bring it back up please, only in the last length have human beings began to think about whether or not slavery was right or wrong, and began to think about ways that they might address the human wrong that is slavery. So that's a very, very tiny portion of our collective history. So beginning in about the middle of the 18th century, so here we're talking about the 1750s forward, was there any serious global, international human rights movement to begin the end of slavery? All right, so if you could hold this for me. We're talking only about this much of this line. It would take another 100 years, about this much of this line, till the year 1865 for the United States to finally ban slavery after a terrible civil war, and another 50 years for the international community under the aegis of what was called the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, for slavery actually to be banned illegally. So this much of our history is when slavery has been banned.
But don't we still have slavery in some places?
That's very true, Arda. And that's why I like to tie, we didn't practice this, but this is why I like to tie this knot at the end of this rope. Because we still have slavery in some parts of the world today, forms of modern slavery. But the important thing is that in the last 100 years, slavery supported by the state, slavery supported by government, slavery justified by religion, this is no longer the case. Slavery is now illegal, but for much of our time it's not. It's not been so. It's been perfectly legal. It's been supported by states. You can buy and sell human beings. Now, the reason why I like to do this demonstration, and it's hard to do it without a live audience, is that there's a lot of problems that we face now. And that's one of the reasons why I came out to this park. I'm looking up at an orange sun. The air is filled with soot. It's tough to breathe, right? It's tough to breathe. Everything is covered in ash. And hopefully by the time you watch this in a couple weeks, it will no longer be the case. But right now, we are facing undeniable evidence of what climate change is doing to our world. And it's making us sick, and it's making us poor, and it's affecting our lives in terrible and in unimaginable ways. And it seems so overwhelming. But slavery also seems so overwhelming. But in the last 200 years, human beings said, enough. We're smart enough, we can organize, and we can bring about a change that has to come. So I say this to you. You're the best and brightest we have in California today. Making sure that this doesn't happen, or this can end, is part of what it means to be an undergraduate at UC Davis. We're asking you to become engaged, to work, to study, so that we can address things like climate change or modern slavery that's not in this line. And we can address forms of inequality or racial injustice. It can be done. Slavery is no longer with us, and there's other human wrongs that we've ended. All right, before I go, just a couple things. Thank you, Arda. Round of applause for Arda, please. Yay! Each of our sections, slavery, colonialism, and war and genocide, begins with 2 theses and 2 research questions. These are done to help us organize our lectures and organize the way we study for examinations, right? The first of these theses is that slavery exists when it makes economic sense. Slavery exists when it makes economic sense. And we'll have a chance to talk about that more in the Q&A section. The second thesis is that slavery exists when individual human beings and human groups are considered not quite human. In other words, it's possible to imagine human beings who aren't quite human and use that belief to justify slavery. And I have 2 research questions. How does slavery affect the enslaved human being? And we, in this class, we don't talk about slaves. We talk about enslaved people. Enslaved people. And the second is, how does slavery affect those enslaving human beings? So these are 2 broad research questions added to the thesis statements that we'll use to discuss and that you'll also talk about in your sections. All right, stay with me. We'll now resume the live portion of this class on Zoom.